I'd like to welcome you to Berkeley time. For those of you not familiar, we always start at 10 after the hour for everything, and sometimes that drifts into 12, 13, 14 after the hour. But regardless, we're delighted to have you here for one of our psychology department's most venerable traditions, the Distinguished Faculty Lecture. My name is Ann Kring. I'm the chair of the Department of Psychology, and I'm glad to see all of you here. Today, you're in for a real treat to hear from Steve Palmer. Just a quick history about our series, this Distinguished Faculty Lecture series. It began in the late 1980s. It went on for several years and then took a hiatus for reasons I'm not aware of, but it was thankfully revived in the mid-2000s with a talk by Phil and Carolyn Cowan, and we've had a Distinguished Faculty Lecture every year for the past 10 years. Christina Maslach was our speaker last year. We have a tradition where another faculty member introduces our speaker, and so without further ado, I'm going to turn this over to Professor Irv Hafter, who's going to introduce Steve to us today.
I apologize for running across the campus and looking like this, and because I left the talk and the slides at home. And I can tell you they're really good slides. So I'm going to have to wing it, and you'll be happy because it'll be a short intro. Steve Palmer was born and raised in New Jersey, where he became an avid horse jumper. That means he doesn't jump on the horses jump with him, and a star student. And then he followed his father to Princeton, where he got the Warren Medal for top undergraduate and graduated summa cum laude. So he wasn't dumb. He went off to San Diego, and I had some beautiful slides of him from San Diego days, which I'll give to Steve later. He got there and went to work for the group with Don Norman and Peter Lindsay and Dave Rummelhart, where they were doing miraculous new things in cognitive psychology. Steve was a member of the group. They said he seemed a little straight-laced for University of California in those days, but what the hell. He finished his degree almost, and came up here to apply for a job. I was in England at the time on a sabbatical, and I came back and found that they had hired a cognitive psychologist. And then I had to go get a modern dictionary and to find out what a cognitive psychologist was. I also found out that in great fear of some of those dreadful universities in the East grabbing him, they had brought him here before he had turned his thesis in. And so I got to learn about cognitive psychology because I was appointed to read it and keep up the department standards. It was an amazing experience. I learned about all kinds of things of how people could look at the structure of the world and infer processes of perception in ways that were kind of new to me. I came from very old school. It was a wonderful experience. Got to know Steve, and it was great fun. In fact, a few years later, he moved his lab downstairs, and we've been sort of hip to hip for, joined at the hip forever in our labs in the basement of Toma, which is a truly horrible place. So after a few years here, the cognitive group was not taking off, and our then chairman, Steve Glickman, called me in and said, "I'd like you to be head of the cognitive group." And I said, "I'm not sure what cognitive psychology is. This doesn't matter, you've got Palmer." So young Palmer and I took on this group. We founded a Friday afternoon seminar, broad seminar, which is the first of its kind in the department, that lasted for years and years and years. We'd get 100 people there. It was incredible. It was wild. We founded some other things during those years. We started up a thing with Stanford, where we meet with the Stanford students every year, our students and their students, and that's been incredibly successful ever since. Some of the beautiful pictures I had, one was about the Stanford meeting. I noticed when I would go down there the first few years that we'd get the eyes like, oh, they're the Berkeleys. Look at the way they're dressed. Because we were really with real preppies down there on the farm. And so one year we were getting ready to go down to Palo Alto, and I was always a little nervous about that. And one of my students came in and showed me T-shirts she had printed for all the students that were in black, and in psychedelic it said sex, drugs, and psychophysics. And I thought, oh God, Gordon Bauer's going to cut us off at the limbs. So I go down there and I do the only sensible thing. As the students are coming in, I'm talking to Gordon like this to keep his back to them so he can't see. Then we hear this loud, ta-da! And in leaps Professor Palmer with his sex, drugs, and psychophysics shirt. It was a beautiful moment. Steve had some good times here. Irvin Rock, we all know him as our beloved Irvin Rock, came out here from Rutgers, and he and Steve became the closest of friends and collaborators. They took up new issues in classical Gestalt psychology. They worked wonderfully together. I know that was some of Steve's happiest years. People ought to know he did a lot for the university. He can probably tell you all about his work. If I had lists of his honors and his invited addresses and his keynote speeches and all that, and you probably wouldn't remember it anyway. I will tell you this. He got grants through the years, not only through the NSF, but also through the NIMH and from Amy's Kitchens up in Petaluma. He perhaps can tell you about that. They make pizza. So anyway, we had this group together. We've had lots and lots of fun through the years. In the last decade or so, Steve went off on another tangent. He said he knew a lot about the structure of perception. He wanted to understand how it related to art. As only Steve, I can imagine, would do, he did a sabbatical taking freshman art classes at a junior college in Santa Rosa and did a lot of nice paintings while he was there. He's a spectacularly wonderful photographer, and I brought some pictures of his photographs. And if you really want to get a nice picture, just buy one from Steve on the web. You can do that, like Art Shimomura. Steve has been such a good friend to us all these years. He's never been afraid to help us. He's never been afraid to speak out. People used to think he was a bit of a pain in the whatever because he would sit at colloquia and you could see he was about a half an hour ahead of the talker. And he's just bubbling over there. And then we'd jump up to ask a speech or make a little question, and it would come out a beautifully formed new theory that was better than the one we had just heard. And the students said they found him kind of intimidating because at first, so it was Steve who came up with the idea that now students must ask the first 3 questions at our colloquia, which I think is a very nice thing. It's been just such a pleasure having him here through the years. I'll tell you one last thing for Steve. I wrote, some of the graduate students gave me pieces which I had written down, I don't remember, but I'll try to paraphrase one. She said, whenever they gave a colloquium or a talk in seminar, they were terrified because they were just sure that Steve was going to come up with things they hadn't thought of. And she said, especially when Toby Dye in my lab was getting ready for his orals, he put faces on the blackboard of who the people were, and he put in circles what he thought they would ask. And in Steve, it said, he'll ask something that I really hadn't thought of before, but it's really bang on. Well, that's Steve. I want to say for all of my friends here and all of us that you have been such a treasure in this department. It's really an honor to be here. And please let me sit down. Thank you.
Well, let me thank you, for that glorious introduction. I've got to say, I'm kind of glad you didn't bring the introduction that you'd written. I'll try to fill in a few of the details around the talk that Irv just gave. The title of my talk is As Good as It Gets, Structure and Harmony in My Journey as a Perceptual Psychologist. And it's a very carefully chosen title. One of the choices was my journey as a perceptual psychologist. And this I really have to thank Rona for, I think. She was the one who encouraged me to give this talk and make it be about my career and my life and my journey, essentially. And it brought to mind this phrase of Steve Jobs, is that the journey is the reward. And I really realized in preparing this talk that that's absolutely true. You know, in your career, you're motivated to get to publish this or give that talk or whatever, and it happens, and it's gone like that. What's important is enjoying the process of getting there. So that's one of the themes that I want to emphasize here. The other is this choice, as good as it gets. It's actually a triple entendre. The first one I'm sure you've all got, which is that goodness is a dimension of the way I feel about my career at Berkeley. It was, if not as good as it could possibly get, certainly plenty good enough. The second is, though, that goodness is a central construct in Gestalt theory, and I'm a Gestalt psychologist, or at least I started out as a Gestalt psychologist. And so that's the second meaning. And the third one is that this notion of goodness of fit, which I'll get to at the end, is actually a central construct of the kind of approach that I've taken in aesthetic theory in the last few years. So just to let you in on the secret, what goodness in Gestalt theory is, there's this thing called the principle of pregnance, which says that what we perceive is as good as the prevailing conditions allow. And the reason for saying this is that very often what we perceive is underdetermined by the stimulation out there. So here you probably see a blue circle behind a red square, but you don't have to see that. That is what we usually see. It might be the case that it's actually a Pac-Man that's just notched up against that square. Or it might even be the case that there's a sort of circly thing with some crazy squiggle on the side. And the Gestalt notion of pregnance, of goodness, was that what we perceived was the one that was as good as it gets, that the circle is better in their sense of symmetry, regularity, and so forth, and structure and harmony, those words that I used in my title as well. As far as the goodness of fit in aesthetics, in fact, what we find is that people like things to the degree that they fit well within their relative context. At the end of the talk, I'll get to that. I want to give you one little example here. I'm going to play a little bit of music, and I'm going to show you two album covers that have different colors, and I'm going to ask you which one you think fits better with the music. So here's the music. Okay, and there are two choices that Enya could have made for the color of her album cover, and how many of you think that the best fitting one is the one on the left, the bluish one? And how many think the one on the right, the reddish one? Okay, so we got about 95% saying the right thing. No, it's just saying what most people say. So those are some examples. So what I want to do first is give you a quickie roadmap of what my journey was. As Irv mentioned, I started out in New Jersey, WHS is Westfield High School. And I graduated and I ended up at Princeton. And there I met these two guys, Sam Glucksberg and Peter Ornstein. And Peter became my advisor at Princeton. You had to do a senior honors thesis. He was my honors thesis advisor. And there I did something that was then called experimental psychology. And I graduated from Princeton and went to UCSD, as Irv also mentioned, where I fell in with these other two guys, Don Norman and Dave Rummelhart. And there we did something, a newfangled form of experimental psychology, which was called cognitive psychology. Hey, something new. So then I ended up at Berkeley, landed this job before, no postdoc or anything like, before I even got my degree, as Irv mentioned. And there I met some more interesting people, like Eleanor Rosch, who unfortunately couldn't make it today, and Irv Hafter. That's what he looked like back then. And most important of all, of course, my PDP-11. That was the computer that I used to do all my research on back in those days. I met some other people like John Searle, and he's sort of emblematic of a whole raft of people that I'll mention later on in cognitive science, because I started working with the cognitive science group. And I learned about that while I was at Berkeley. And as Irv also mentioned, Irvin Rock, who was one of the most important influences on my career, and we collaborated on a number of research projects and had joint lab meetings for an awfully long time. And Bill Princemetal, who is also allied with us. Then, during the later years at Berkeley, I became a vision scientist. So this is my fourth different kind of science that I do here. And I started hanging out with people like Jitendra Malik, Russ and Karen Develoy, and Marty Banks. And then for my last decade or more at Berkeley, I started doing aesthetic science. That camera, that's my first digital SLR camera, which changed my life in a number of ways. And one of which was it actually led me to start doing aesthetic science, together with my students, then students, they're now professors, Karen Schloss, and Jonathan Sammartino, and Bruce Mangan, who Bruce had been a graduate student with me back in maybe the 70s or 80s. And he had some very interesting ideas about aesthetics back then. And I was his thesis advisor, and I signed his thesis, but I really didn't believe a lot of the things that he said back then. But I've come to believe them now. So, Bruce, this is hats off to you. So the structure of this, I'm going to talk about Princeton and UCSD, and then I'm going to talk about a few years getting established here at Berkeley. And then I'm going to go through some research, and I hope it's not too boring. These are about hierarchical structure in visual perception, what's called perceptual grouping, and figure ground organization. And these are problems of vision that have been called mid-level vision. That means that it's not early vision, it's not about retinal receptors and the way that those things are hooked to each other, and it's not about what people call high-level vision, although I don't think it's what they call high-level vision is all that high, which would be about object recognition and contextual effects on object recognition. It's this middle part of vision, which is where you take this sort of undifferentiated visual field and you divide it into objects and parts and pieces, and you put them together in three-dimensional space, and some are closer than others. That's what this stuff is about. And it's something that most of us never think about, but some of us think about a hell of a lot. Then I'm going to talk about some of my years in cognitive and vision science here at Berkeley, and finally about aesthetics. So what happened at Princeton? Well, first of all, I had this major dilemma, which was, what should my major be? And philosophy or psychology. Initially, I took two wonderful courses from two wonderful philosophers, Tom Nagel and Gil Harman. Tom Nagel, some of you may know of. He's the guy who wrote the famous paper called What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Fascinating guy. And they got me interested in not only philosophy of mind, but sort of what I could do with my mind. I had a Helen Keller experience in Tom Nagel's class where I finally got it, what it was like to actually think through an argument logically and just nail it, that you knew you were right when you got there. And that was a huge thing for me. But I also took these wonderful courses in experimental psychology with Sam Glucksberg and Peter Ornstein. And I want to relate one story about Sam. He taught the course that I took first, and I said, Professor Glucksberg, could I be a student with you? And he said, sure, kid, read this. And he hands me this book. It's Cognitive Psychology by Ulrich Neisser. It was the Bible. It was like one of the things that launched this revolution, the cognitive revolution. And I said, okay. And so I took it, and I got to about page 17, and I went back to Sam Glucksberg, and I said, excuse me, Professor Glucksberg, but can you tell me what a chi-square is? And he said, don't worry about it, kid. It's just some statistical mumbo-jumbo. And then I took the statistics course from Peter Ornstein, and he explained what the mumbo-jumbo was. I did a thesis there. It was called The Effects of Rehearsal Strategy on Serial Probed Recall. And I published it in the Journal of Experimental Psychology as an undergraduate. And that number there refers to the number of people who have cited that paper since then. This was not one of my great papers. But like I say, this was on the cusp between experimental psychology and cognitive psychology. This was very much a paper that Leo Postman could have done, or someone who was sort of in the experimental psychology tradition. So I went to UCSD, which my professors at Berkeley called La Jolla. They didn't know about La Jolla. They didn't know about UCSD. They had never heard of these people. The picture on the right shows Don and Dave back in those days when they looked like, just like us, the students. We all looked like hippies. And we did computer simulations of human memory and language, which is not perception, but this was really an early precursor of cognitive science, I believe. And I got into visual perception in a sort of interesting way, which was I was a member of what was called the verb group. So we were doing language understanding. Dave Rumelhart, that's Dedrick Gettner there to the right, and I and several other people were part of this. And we were trying to figure out what the internal representations of verbs like go and walk and buy and sell and things like that were. It was beautiful, beautiful stuff. But our representation of nouns was like non-existent. It was just like a little slot, one unified thing. And I thought, well, what about nouns? So I became the noun group at UCSD. I wanted to figure out what the internal representations, the structure of objects were. And it wasn't really very far to get from what are the structure of objects to how is that identified, how are those structures identified visually, and that's what got me into visual perception. So my very first paper about visual perception is this one, Memory Effects of Contextual Scenes. And you notice there the number 489. This has been a much more popular paper. And it's actually in a lot of introductory textbooks. The basic idea is this, that the question is, how do we identify objects? And the sort of received wisdom at the time was, well, it really doesn't matter where you see it. You're going to see, if you see an elephant, you're going to see an elephant and recognize it as an elephant, whether it's in the zoo or whether it's in your living room. And I wasn't so sure that this was true, so I did an experiment in which we showed people initially a contextual scene of some sort, and then we flashed up very briefly a picture of, in this case, a loaf of bread, a mailbox, or a bass drum, and measured how likely people were to be able to correctly identify the object. And the results are shown here. And when the context is appropriate, as this scene is to the loaf of bread, people were getting it right more than 80% of the time. If there was no context, about 60% of the time. And if there was an inappropriate or even worse, misleading context, less than 50% of the time. So this was the first demonstration of these kinds of contextual effects, which have since gone on to become a real industry in the vision community. And even today, there's a lot of work going on how people recognize scenes of different sorts. Now, my dissertation was called, this was the dissertation that Irv read. It was called Structural Aspects of Perceptual Organization. And when I looked back at it and thought about it, I realized that this dissertation really kind of contained 4 key papers that I wrote. I mean, I should have quit then. And all of these things have become pretty well known. I've already mentioned the first one about the scenes and the identification of objects. The second one was really trying to put forward this idea that I had, which was that visual perception of objects is hierarchical. I should say, before I go on, that anybody who knows anything about psychology is going to hear me say these things and think, well, duh, of course. But remember, this was 40 years ago, and nobody had done these things before. So these were seminal papers, actually. So the idea was that, for example, this scene of the leopard on the branch with the sky behind is going to be represented in terms of a hierarchical structure. In fact, my job talk at Berkeley was given about the experiment on about contextual effects and about this notion of hierarchical structure. The third paper I'm going to tell you about in just a second, and the fourth one I won't have time to. I probably won't have time to do much of what I'm planning on doing, to tell you the truth. So in this hierarchical, this was an empirical demonstration that there was hierarchical structure in perceptual organization. So I used these funny little figures. Nowadays, you probably couldn't get away with doing something quite so simple. But one of the things we asked, we show people a figure and say, please divide this into 2 parts that contain 3 lines each. And so this shows some possible parsings of that figure. The first one is a high goodness parsing, and the high goodness is defined by this little model that I had saying that parts should be things where the segments are close together, are connected to each other, are symmetrical, and have good structure in the sense of Gestalt psychology. And the one on the right, for example, has very low goodness. So then we looked at the parsings that people picked and looked at the rank order of how good that parsing was for that figure according to this theory. And you can see that by the first 3 possible parsings, basically nobody ever saw those, nobody ever reported those. And the very first one was used more than 60% of the time. And we also had people do a rating task, which also showed this very strong linear, almost linear relationship between the model and the ratings that people had. Which was a pretty convincing demonstration. So at this point, I get to Berkeley and I start teaching, and who do I meet but Eleanor Rosch. I'm sorry Eleanor isn't here, and I could spend the rest of my talk talking about what a fabulous scientist and wonderful person Eleanor Rosch is. She has discovered more important things than almost anybody else I can think of. She's a centerpiece of the cognitive science program, or has been at Berkeley, and I was lucky enough to be her close colleague when I first came to Berkeley. We did a lot of things together. One of them was that we co-created this course called Information Processing, Psychology 126. We also taught it at the graduate level, and it actually ultimately becomes a mainstay of the cognitive science program, and it was called Cognitive Science 100, more or less. It got to be so much content in this course that eventually we split it into two different courses, 126 then called Perception, which I taught, and 123 she called Concepts and Categories, which she taught. The other person I ran into was Irv Hafter, my erstwhile introduction. And we taught this course together called Computers in Psychology, which was at the graduate level, trying to bring the graduate students into the information processing age within psychology. This was back in the 1970s, right? So we're talking about where PDP-11s were like, state of the art. The other thing that happened then was that Ellen and I established a lab together, which if we called it anything, we could have called it Ception, Per, and Con. I always kind of liked that. We actually called one of our pro seminars Ception, Per, and Con. And we had joint students. It was a big lab. We had at least 8 students most of the time. There's some of them are listed here. Lynn Robertson is in the audience right there. And we did a very important paper together on what we called canonical perspective. And the idea here was that another piece of received wisdom in the field of object identification was that it didn't matter where you saw an object from, what perspective you saw it in, you'd be able to recognize it from the front or the side or the front side or whatever, but I didn't think that was true either. So we started to do these experiments, and this shows you if you can see them, probably not. 12 different views of a horse from different perspectives, one of which was the best one, best as defined by people's ratings of how much does this picture look like a horse? I mean, you can imagine that this one, which is a top view, that doesn't look very much like a horse. And we did this for like 12 different objects that shows the best views of those 12 objects, and we measured how long it took people to identify objects from those different perspectives. And well, this is another duh result now, but then nobody knew it, that the more canonical the view was, according to our measures, the faster people were able to identify it. And once again, this is something where now there's a whole industry of people working on perspective effects on visual perception. The next series of experiments that I did, I'm going to sort of try to truncate this, was on ambiguous triangles, which are equilateral triangles, and they're ambiguous in the sense that they can be seen to point in any of 3 directions here, toward 3 o'clock, toward 11 o'clock, or toward 7 o'clock. And you can measure this by sticking it inside a clock face and just asking people to say, where does it point? And they say 3, 7, 11 for one of these triangles. But I was interested in these what are called configural effects, where it's not just one triangle, but there's some stuff around it which biases the way that people see it. And the reason that I'm interested in that, or was interested in that, still am, is in fact because it's a kind of Gestalt phenomenon. The whole is determining the perception of the individual parts. So you can take the same triangles, these are all the same triangles, and just a configuration of them along different axis alignments, and you see the first one is pointing toward 3, and then 11 and 7 o'clock. And you can do the same thing with what we call the base-aligned configurations, where they're aligned along one of their sides. But here again, there's actually an axis of symmetry of these things, which points the triangles in the direction that people typically see them point in. And we also included these combined, which are just the concatenation of those two things. And we wanted to do that because we thought they're actually not as strongly biased as the other ones were. And that's what we found out. A single triangle, the probability that they're going to choose any given direction is about 30%. But you have them in an axis or a base-aligned condition, the probability that they're going to pick the direction that goes along the axis of symmetry is now more than twice as great. And in fact, the combination is somewhat less. I'm not going to go into why that is, but you can see I'm trying to do demos here where I don't have to show you data and I don't have to go into long explanations because I'd fall apart if I had to do that. Now this work on hierarchical structure in visual perception got me interested in this phenomenon known as perceptual grouping, which the Gestalt psychologist had studied back in the 1920s. And I'm interested in it because, in fact, if you have a display where there's no grouping versus where there is grouping, in this case into pairs, that's where you start getting this hierarchical structure from. Grouping is going to define those hierarchies of parts and wholes that I was talking about in my initial thing. And these are some of the many factors that Gestalt psychologists identified as being relevant to grouping. And there's two important papers that I did, one identifying a new factor called common region, and another one that I did with Irvin Rock, where he kind of tried to rethink perceptual organization in a more modern context. So common region is just, here's a bunch of dots that have no particular structure, no paired structure, but if you put them inside of common regions, boy, they sure do take on a group structure. Duh, right? But nobody, the last people who'd worked on this was in 1923, and nobody had ever realized this, I guess. And it's a very strong factor because you can take dots that are already structured into pairs by virtue of proximity, and you put circles around them, you put them in common regions that break up those groups, and boy, you see the common region groupings. Here's a little demonstration of smaller versus larger common regions. And I think you'll agree with me that you tend to see the grouping within the sort of smaller regions. But of course, you can change that by making these familiar configurations. And as a little demonstration, this was a neat paper because there was no data in the paper. I mean, this was published in like 1982. And of course, everybody in psychology was being very objective, and they had reaction time measures of everything and probability measures of everything. And I really thought that the Gestaltists had it right, that if you had a powerful enough phenomenon, you didn't need data. So this was a paper that had no data in it. My last demonstration was about the importance of common region between these two placards. Relevant to the times, I think. And then I did this paper with Irv Rock on uniform connectedness, which I'm not going to have time to do justice to. The simple thing is to talk about, like I did the last one, just a demonstration. There's those ungrouped dots. Boy, you connect them and they sure do group together. And you can overcome proximity by grouping them together. And they don't even have to be uniformly connected. Connectedness by itself is really important. Another thing that people had somehow missed. But the other thing that we did, and this is the rethinking perceptual organization part, was we realized that there's something special about uniform connectedness. That because I'd always wondered, so what's the process of getting to this hierarchy like? And this is the paper where I really sort of started to work on that in earnest. And the idea was that, well, the initial thing you do is you divide it up sort of like a stained glass window into these uniform connected regions that are either uniform in color or uniform in texture. So the leopard would be one uniform connected region because even though it's got spots in it, in fact, it's a texture that's pretty much the same all over. And then you start constructing your hierarchy from this entry level, which are the uniform connected regions. And then the idea was that you can either go down from there or up from there, and going downward is called parsing. So the leopard would be parsed into its head and its tail and its legs and so forth. And the grouping part then would be grouping into superordinate regions, like all those red regions would be red circles corresponding to the sky would be grouped into a single region, and the different parts of the branch and so forth, and then it would all be put together at the highest level, which was the entire scene. And that was kind of a bridge. In fact, that was a bridge between old-style perceptual organization psychology a la Gestalt psychologists, which at that time was being presented in textbooks in pretty much exactly the same way that it had been presented in textbooks in the 1920s. No connection with modern vision science and computational models and things like this. So this was our attempt to bring that in. And I think that was really the first inkling that I had that the field needed something about a book about vision science that made an attempt to connect all of that old stuff, all that really good perceptual psychology that was done by people like Irv Rock and Julie Hochberg and so forth, and connected it with modern theory. And that was the genesis of the book that I'll tell you about in a few minutes, hopefully. I'm going to have to skip over this. This is a really lovely paper. It's the one that was going to demonstrate to you that not everything that we did was, oh, duh. And Romy is here. Romy is right here. What we did was to try to ask when grouping happens. Is it early or is it late in visual perception? When we try to think about grouping Gestalt stuff in modern terms, computational terms, where is it? And everybody assumed that it was really early. In that nicer book, he talks about how early grouping happens, like almost as though it happens in the retina or something. But it was very well established that that was the case. And these experiments showed that that was not the case, that in fact, and I'll show you I'll just go. So the task that people had was to say whether the group of squares in the center grouped to the left side or to the right side, and this was a plastic strip that was hung over the middle thing. There are actually pieces of paper for these squares, and they were made of the same pieces of paper, but the darkness of this corresponds to the darkness of that. So if it were a retinal process, then this would be seen as grouping to the right, and if it were a higher level process after we perceived the reflectances of the surfaces, it would be grouped with the left. And in fact, almost everybody grouped it to the left. I'll skip over the rest of this stuff. Sorry, Romy, but talk to Irv after. Okay, this led me eventually into another Gestalt phenomenon called figure ground organization, which is really about depth perception and the ownership of a border between two regions. So it's defined in something like this, that it happens when one region along a border is seen as closer to the viewer, and to own that border so that it shapes the closer region. So in this case, there's a single border, a left side and a right side. It's ambiguous about which side is closer and figural in this sense. If you see the black region as being figure, you see this kind of claw-like shape. And if you see the white region as figure, you see this kind of lip-like shape, okay? And you can see it either way. The Gestalt psychologist had looked at a bunch of different factors that biased people towards seeing something as figure as opposed to ground. For example, surroundedness. I trust almost everybody sees this as a black blobby figure on a white background. That's because it's the surrounded region. You could see this as a hole, right? You could see this as a hole with a black background behind it. And the smaller region, the more convex region, all of these black regions are biased toward being seen as figure, and you can show that it's not the color of it, because if you switch the colors, exactly the same regions are seen as figural. Well, the connection with grouping here was that Joe Brooks, a student of mine, and I began to wonder if there wasn't something relevant about grouping to figure ground. You can even think about figure ground perception as being the question of with which side is the border grouped, right? That's even a grouping word. But nobody had ever thought about this, apparently. And we realized that, well, if we can make the regions similar, more or less similar to the edge in some way, then we should be able to bias which region is seen as in front. So we tested the 6 similarity-based grouping factors that we could think of. And I'm only going to demonstrate one of them for you, naturally the strongest, but of course, oh well, which is common fate. So here we've got an ambiguous figure ground. We put some texture on here because in order to make the region be more similar to the border, we have to have some way of articulating the regions. So now what we're doing is we're moving the texture and the border in the same way. And I trust that everybody sees that as a black region in front of a white region. And it's not just the fact that they're moving, because if we keep the border stationary and those dots on the left side stationary and only move the ones on the right, typically then, this is not quite as strong an effect, but typically you still see the black side as being closer, right? So it's the grouping of the edge with the border. And not only was it was a way of unifying a few of these had been noticed before, but this was a way of unifying them all and saying, well, these are all examples of the same thing, which is the connection between grouping and figure ground. Another piece of very nice research that I did relatively recently with Tandra Ghose, who's also in the audience, sitting back there, was on something called extremal edges. And extremal edges are edges of, I'll put this up here so you can see it, of an object where the object surface occludes itself. It's typically a curved surface. There's an edge, depending on where you see it. It's in different places. And it's defined usually by a shading pattern, where along the edge it's much darker than it is in the center and so forth. So in this particular display here, the left side contains an extremal edge along that side, and the right side does not. And virtually everybody is going to see the left side as being closer. They can also be defined by textures or shading and textures together. I'm not going to show you any of the data. They're really quite compelling. I'm going to give you a demonstration. This is that factor I talked about before of surroundedness. Okay, so most people are going to see this as a light gray circle on a dark gray background. Now, if I make this contour, this circular contour, an extremal edge on the inside, then everybody sees it. It's a sphere. It's a ball against a flat background. But if I put the extremal edge contour on the outside, you see a bagel. I mean, you see a hole. And you never see this, almost never see this as a hole. You never see that as a hole. Almost everybody sees that as a hole. So this is just a demonstration of how powerful extremal edges are as a figure ground factor relative to all the Gestalt stuff that had come before. Basically, it overpowers just about everything. Tandra and I demonstrated that quantitatively and using good methods. This is the Occlusion Illusion. I thought I had discovered it, but it turned out that Connectedness did. Well, if you're going to have somebody discover an illusion before you, Connectedness is a good guy to do it. The question is, which of these two black semicircles is bigger? And how many people think this one's bigger? Raise your hand. How many think this is bigger? Raise your hand. 100%. All right. And you can demonstrate, I mean, I actually generated this one by just copying this thing over and turning that rectangle to white. So you can make this, that semicircle get bigger and smaller relative to the other one just by turning it on and off. I wasn't actually going to go into this too much, but there's the opposite illusion that you would think would be there, but it's not. In fact, it goes the other way. So here we've got a sort of double-edged occlusion illusion, right? I mean, that part is that, and that part is that. So this circle should look like it's really way wider, right? How many people see it as narrower as opposed to wider? How many see it as wider? It goes in the opposite direction. So if you want to find out why that's the case, read that paper. It took us a while to figure that one out. These are some of the things that we learned in this phase. I mean, I've done work on perceptual organization my whole career. We've learned about hierarchical structure and the way that it represents different kinds of context, it's appropriate or not. We've identified some new factors of grouping. We have this hypothesis about how hierarchies are constructed, and we've discovered these two new features of figure ground organization. Ta-da. One of the things that happened sort of in parallel with this was that cognitive science became invented, or not invented at Berkeley, but it became established at Berkeley through a confluence of a really remarkable set of people. So in computer science, we had Bob Walensky, Lotfi Zada. In philosophy, Bert Dreyfus and John Searle. In linguistics, Chuck Fillmore, George Lakoff, Wally Chafe, John Ohala, and Len Talmy. Anthropology, Paul Kay, who later moved to linguistics. In psychology, we had Eleanor and myself, Dan Slobin and Sue Irvin Tripp. And in sociology, John Gumpers. Excuse me if I've left people out from this sort of early cadre. These are the people that I remember. And these are the people who were on the steering committee that wrote the first Sloan Foundation grant, which got cognitive science going at Berkeley and eventually kept the scientific enterprise afloat at Berkeley. I was involved from the very beginning, but it really got intense for me in the 1990s when I became the director of the Institute for Cognitive Studies, which was the precursor to ICBS, and I handed that one over to Rich Ivory. I was the head of the undergraduate major in cognitive science, and I was actually the advisor for all of the students in the program. Now, that may sound like a big job, but when I first started, I remember the first graduation of cognitive science, there were 2 people getting cognitive science degrees, and I actually handed them out in tandem, in parallel, so that they could both claim to be the first cognitive science major at Berkeley. But by the time I was done in like 2000, there were hundreds of people graduating in cognitive science, and it got even bigger than that afterwards. One of the important things I did was with Alison Gopnik was to create Cognitive Science 100, Basic Issues in Cognition, which then became required for all cog-sci majors. It was really kind of modeled after Psychology 100, which Irv Hafter and Steve Glickman and Jerry Mendelsohn and a couple of other people did. Not many people will remember that. But the thing that cognitive science did for me, other than give me a much greater administrative workload, was to come to appreciate the interdisciplinarity of cognitive science. And I started to realize that the way that I was teaching my vision course could be a whole lot more interdisciplinary than that. I mean, I was running into people like Jitendra Malik, who was talking about computational models of grouping and hierarchical structure and things like that. So I got into cognitive science. I actually wrote a bunch of papers that, rather than being psychology papers, really, I think, are more cognitive science papers than anything else, only one of which I'm going to mention here. This is a paper that appeared in something called The Brain and Behavioral Sciences, which I actually promised myself at one point that I would never write an article for that journal. It's one of these peer commentary things where you write this target article, and boy, do they mean target. And then they get about 60 people to write these scathing attacks on you. But what I was trying to do was trying to come to terms with a very, very old philosophical problem called the inverted spectrum argument, which some of you probably heard about. John Locke argued that people can't know whether their color experiences are the same as somebody else's color experiences. And it was generally accepted as true for a very long period of time. So the idea is simply this, that I don't know whether you can read this or not, but this says your rainbow experience and my rainbow experience. So you see red at the top of the rainbow and purple at the bottom, and I see the same rainbow, but I see purple at the top and red at the bottom. And Locke's question was, well, how could you possibly tell the difference between this? You can't tell by asking people to name the color because, of course, I'm going to call that thing at the top of my rainbow red just like you will, because it's the same color as fire hydrants and Macintosh apples and blood and so forth, and the one at the bottom I'm going to call violet. So all of our words are going to match up perfectly well. I'm just going to have the opposite, spectrally inverted experiences. So I sort of took this on from the perspective of a vision scientist. And I argued that, well, you really can tell the difference if you just make the right measurements. So for example, suppose we ask you with your rainbow and me with my rainbow to point or name the color that looks the brightest. Well, you're going to put, unless you're colorblind, you're going to point to yellow over there, and I'm going to point to blue-green over there, right? It's the same, my experience is the same as your experience of yellow. I'm going to call it blue-green, but it's going to be the brightest thing. So if people really were spectrally inverted, the way Locke was assuming they would be, we could tell. It's not that you can't tell. And there are a number of other ways that you can tell spectral inversion. There's some other, this was a like 40-page paper, so there's a lot of other stuff in there that I'm not going to go into. But as I said, cognitive science led me to revamp my perception course, and then I started writing this book. I started writing about 1988, and I finished it around 1998. It's a big book. I should have brought a copy of it. It's like 900 pages, and I'm astonished that I managed to write it. And I still claim that I never knew all of the stuff that was in that book at one time. I'd read a part, and then I would remember it, but I meanwhile would have forgotten something else. And I have to say, it's my single best known and most influential contribution to science. It's still in print, and it's been used to train a generation of vision scientists. I actually found out it's used in a lot of computer science courses where they teach the technical stuff in their own textbook, but then they assign my book to try to give some broader context for it. And I looked as of yesterday, it has been cited 2,538 times, which is more than any of my other things. One of the most interesting criticisms that was leveled at that book, when you go on to Amazon.com and read the 5 people who've actually read it, one of them said, this is a really good book about vision. The only problem with it is it doesn't ever mention aesthetics. It doesn't mention anything about aesthetics. I didn't read, it wasn't like I went into aesthetic science because of that. I went into aesthetic science because I bought this camera. And also because I taught this course. Now, this course was absolutely crucial to these last 10 or 15 years of my career. It's called Color and Consciousness. And I taught it with first Tandra Gose, who is here, and also Karen Schloss, who's also here somewhere, there, were my TAs for this course. And it was an interdisciplinary course about color. It was kind of a cognitive science course about color, where we did philosophical issues like the inverted spectrum argument that I told you about the phenomenology of color, what it's like to see red, and the psychophysics of color, the physiology, the computational vision of color constancy, color naming in different cultures, and at the end of the course, we got into color and emotion, and then color and aesthetics. And when we got to the end of the course, I found the research that was available on color aesthetics to be pretty mediocre, and I thought, well, I know how to do experiments. I can do better than that. So I tried, and then in the past 7 years, I looked this up yesterday, we published 35 articles on aesthetic science, not all of them about color, but a lot of them. And is Art here? I co-edited a book with Art Shimomura that was called Aesthetic Science. Not photons to phenomenology, but, and I also, as I say, pursued digital photography. So I did 3 major projects, and I'm going to try to tell you about 2 of them. One is preferences for color, and the other is about music to vision correspondences, because they're sort of my favorites, and I think they're also audience favorites. The work on human color preferences I have done for all this time, for over a decade, with Karen Schloss, who has been the most unbelievable collaborator, graduate student, and postdoc I've ever had. We started this project, we called it the Berkeley Color Project, and we picked out these colors and laid out about almost 30 different tasks, I think, that we had the same people doing these tasks with the same set of colors. And this was actually a model that came out of that color and consciousness course that I taught, because I started doing a research component to that course, and I hit on the idea, well, just think how powerful it would be if we had the same people doing a lot of different experiments on the same colors, that they could they could inform each other, and you get a lot more information that way. So that's what we did. And one of them was we asked people about their color preferences for these 32 colors that I'm going to show you now. We picked 8 different hues, the so-called unique hues of red, green, blue, and yellow, and these combination hues of orange, purple, cyan, which is blue-green, and chartreuse, which is yellow-green. So this guy is cyan, and that guy is chartreuse. And they're around the outside because they're the most saturated, the most vivid colors. And then we sort of chopped through this color space at 4 different places. The saturated cut, which is the one I just showed you. The colors that are sort of halfway between the saturated colors and white at the top. The 4 colors that are halfway between the saturated colors and medium gray in the middle, and the 4 colors that are 8 colors that are halfway between saturated and black at the bottom. Those are the 32 colors we studied. And we got people to rate how much they liked each of these colors with a slider scale. They just had a little slider at the bottom, and it said, I love it at one end. It says, I hate it at the other end. And they just moved it around to where they corresponded to how much they liked it, and then they clicked the mouse. So what did we find? These are preference ratings on the y-axis. I am going to show you data here, okay? So up means I like it a lot, and down below 0 means I don't like it. When you look at the light colors and the muted colors, they're pretty much identical in terms of how much people like them. And generally speaking, at least in the US, and where these were people from around Berkeley, they weren't just students. They were half males, half females. They were half color sophisticated and half color naive. They tend to like the cool colors more than the warm colors. The cool colors being cyan, blue, and purple, and the warm colors being red, orange, yellow, and chartreuse. There's a little blip at yellow, which I'll get to a bit later, why it might be there. The saturated colors have pretty much the same preference shape, like the cool colors more than the warm colors. It's just that Americans, anyway, like saturated colors more. You tend to like colors like these more than you do the more muted ones. The interesting thing was when you looked at the dark colors, the shape of the curve was quite different. And that, for example, if you just look at these 3 sets of colors that have the same degree of vividness, you find that people really don't like yellow, dark yellow. They don't like dark orange, which is kind of brown. I call that dark yellow, I call that yucky poo. And they do like, however, dark green, and they like dark red. So it's not that they just like dark colors or don't like dark colors. There's something funny going on. So we tried to understand how we could explain these, and we thought, duh. Well, it's really just about the colors of things that we like. So we like saturated blue because it's the color of clear sky and clean water. We like saturated cyan because it's the color of swimming pools and tropical oceans. We like dark green because it's the color of healthy vegetation. Dark reds are ripe fruits. And like I said, these are biological waste products, or they are not just that. I mean, there are other things like, chocolate is brown too, and coffee, but anyway. So this is sort of a just so version of what we call the ecological valence theory, which is that it's a great theory. It's like one short sentence long. It says, you like colors to the degree that you like the objects that are that color. Now, it turns out there's a huge amount of complexity that's packed into that, because why do you like the objects, and what are the colors of those objects? And Karen, what we really did was, aside from articulate that theory, which again seems like somebody should have come up with that in the last 200 years, we figured out how to test it. So we tested it with a fairly complex experiment where we had people rate these 32 different colors for preference. We had another group of subjects come in, and we showed them the same 32 colors, but we said, please write down a description of all the things you can think of that are that color. So for this saturated cyan, they'd list swimming pool, tropical ocean, fish tank, or whatever. Then we had a third group of subjects come in, and we just gave them the descriptions and said, how much do you like tropical oceans? How much do you like fish tanks? How much do you like swimming pools? And they would rate that on the slider scale. And the fourth group came in, and they saw both the color and the description that had been given, and we said, how well do these two match? We had to do that because, undergraduates will tell you almost anything, and some people in our sample were undoubtedly colorblind, and they could have been saying things that were totally crazy. So this was a way of down-weighting any of the responses that were just off the wall and up-weighting the ones that were really good matches. And then we took these data and computed from it something that we call the WAVE, the Weighted Affective Valence Estimate. I'm not going to go through with this, except to say that you just multiply the valences times the matches for each of those objects. That's the W star V. And then you take the average of those for that color. So you do this very complicated experiment, and it gives you one number, which is the weighted affective valence estimate for that color. You get 32 colors out of this, 32 numbers out of this procedure, and the question is, how do these correspond to the preference data? And I have to say that we did this experiment initially to show that this theory was wrong. We wanted it to be wrong. We wanted to have a psychophysical answer, something that was based on like cone contrast or something like that. And here's what we found. We actually tested our theory and a couple of other theories, one of which was a theory that was based on cone contrasts. And this is a theory due to Hurlburt and Ling in about 2007. And you do a linear regression model where you fit these cone contrasts, which are well-defined physiological entities, and you can account for 34% of the variance. That's not great. you look at those 32 numbers that we got with no degrees of freedom. I mean, we don't have there's no regression to change weightings or whatever, and we can account for 80% of the variance. That's a correlation of almost 0.9 between the numbers that we get for the waves and the preferences that an entirely different set of subjects gave us. So this was pretty impressive, and we have done a lot more experiments. There was a full replication, actually not by us, in Britain, where the wave preference correlation was 0.81, pretty much the same. We did the same experiment in China and got a much lower correlation, only 0.62. And we thought maybe this was because in China, maybe they're not quite so materialistic as we are in the US, and maybe symbolic things are important. So we redid the whole experiment, but included symbolic things. So we showed people colors and said, sort of what abstract symbols does this remind you of? You know, freedom or longevity or good luck or whatever. And in China then, if you include both the objects and the symbols, then you get your correlations back up to around where we were before. And in fact, there's a beautiful crossover interaction between the US and the Chinese data in terms of the relative importance of symbolic versus object-based associations. And as you might imagine, we are the more materialistic. In fact, we're so materialistic that the symbolic things don't even matter in the US. You actually get slightly worse predictions if you include symbolic stuff. Here's another one that we found. One of the implications of the theory says you like a color to the degree you like the objects that are associated with that color. So we realized at some point that social institutions are included here so that Berkeley students who like Berkeley should like blue and gold better than Stanford students should, and Stanford students should like red and white better than Berkeley students should. And we showed that this is in fact true, and moreover, that the size of the effect, the degree to which Berkeley students like Berkeley blue and gold more than Stanford red and white, is correlated like 0.5 with how much school spirit they rate themselves as having. And they had it was in the cover of Pure Color Preference Experiment, and we didn't say anything. There was really no way they could have known this was about Berkeley and Stanford colors. We did the Stanford students, actually in Jay McClellan's lab down at Stanford. Jay couldn't believe the result, but yeah, it's there. And that's the little blip. Remember the little blip at yellow? Well, a lot of our students were Berkeley students or people from around Berkeley. And I think the little blip there's always a blip at blue. Everybody likes blue, but the blip at yellow may in fact be due to the fact that we had subjects around Berkeley. We also showed that if you give people a slideshow, you can actually bias their preferences. So we did a before-after experiment where we measured their preferences before, and then we showed them a slideshow. And for half the people, the slideshow, all the red objects were really good things like strawberries and apples and red apples and so forth. And the green things were bad stuff like pond scum and mold and snot. And then the other group, of course, got the opposite, where the red things were like bloody eyeballs and lesions and wounds, and the green things were like kiwi fruit and leafy trees and so forth. And when you measure afterwards their preferences, the people who saw the good red stuff like red more than they did before, and they like green less than the one before if they saw the bad green stuff, and vice versa. Another one of those neat crossover interactions. And finally, this was not true in general. Republicans, by and large, generally like blue. And for other reasons, I think, having to do with its being a calm color and conservative and all that sort of thing. But on election day, or right around election day, in fact, the Republicans start to like red, Republicans start to like red more, and Democrats start to like blue more, only around election day. So this is showing us that color preferences are in fact not fixed entities, but they're labile. They change from time to time, context to context. By the way, we did the Berkeley-Stanford study right before big game. I don't know whether you get the same result if you did it at a different time. Now the final thing I want to tell you about is the most fun of all, and this is what we're really focusing on right now, which is this music to color association task, which is, I'm proud to say, the flakiest experiment that I've ever done. but has given some of the most astoundingly consistent results I've ever seen. So we had 48, it was the same 48 people that did the color preference thing, these people. And they listened to 18 different selections of classical orchestral music. And while they were listening, we asked them to choose in order the 5 colors that went best with the music and later the 5 colors that went worst. Don't worry about the worst part and just pick out a color. I'm going to play you a couple of pieces of music here, and I want you to pick out the color that you think goes best with this. So that was, and for each of these composers, Bach, Mozart, and Brahms, we had 3 different tempi of music, a slow, a medium, and a fast. And we have a piece that's in major and a piece that's in minor. It's all orchestral music, no words. So you picked a color for that one, whatever it was. Now I'm going to play you the one that the slow minor Bach and see whether this looks like it should go with the same color. Okay, so how many people for the first piece, how many people were picking colors that were like up here? Raise your hands. And how many people were picking colors that were like down here? Okay, now for the second one, how many people were picking colors that were up here? How many people were picking the colors that were down here? God, you're a great audience. Now, most of you can't see, but it was like 99 to 99%. Okay. Right, so you get some very, very strong biases in terms of the colors that people pick. These are the actual data. I love showing this and saying these are the data. These are the first choice colors for our 48 subjects. And the first piece I showed you is that Bach major fast up at the upper right, and the Bach minor slow is the one at the lower left. And as you can see, the darker, cooler, less vivid colors go with the slower and more minor things, and the lighter, warmer, more vivid colors go better with the faster and major music. Now, just a month or so ago, I wrote a piece for an online journal called Nautilus. It's a science. It's a really cool journal that was about this work, and we did this experiment that included a demo with these 2 pieces, which, by the way, come from the very same piece of music as Bach's Second Brandenburg Concerto. They're just part of different movements. Same orchestra playing it, same everything, except for these kinds of factors. And we got the results of the colors that were picked for, this is the Bach major fast and the Bach minor slow. The size of these rectangles corresponds to the number of people who chose that color. And the number of people is staggering. This was 37,000 people. If you ever doubted the amount of data that you can get on the internet, luckily we had the Nautilus as the platform for this. But you can see that the colors are totally different for the minor slow. In fact, if you look at the biggest rectangles here and try to find the rectangles that correspond, they're up in that little top row, the very smallest ones. And similarly for this, that they're the smallest rectangles there. So it's an amazingly powerful effect. I'm not going to explain quite what this is. This is just a way of sort of quantifying those effects I was talking about. That as the music gets faster, the vividness or the saturation of the colors people pick goes up, and it's more saturated for major than for minor music, and the same thing's true for lightness and yellow versus blue, but not for red versus green. Okay, and we did a replication of this in Mexico, and you might think, well, going to be very different. They actually begged us not to do this experiment. They said, we want to do mariachi bands. We don't listen to this stuff down there. So we did the experiment, and lo and behold, it's kind of a Xerox copy of the results that we got. We're trying to do this in Turkey now with traditional Turkish music in both the US and Turkey, but we don't have the data yet. But this raises the question of why this might happen. And our idea is what we call the emotional mediation hypothesis, which is that people listen to the music and they have some sort of either an emotional response or they have an emotional analysis of what the music sounds like. And then they pick the colors that have the same emotional content or the same emotional associations. And the way that we tested this, I'm sorry I'm going over, my people's phones are telling me I'm going too late. We did this by actually asking people, showing people each of the colors individually and asking them to rate each color on these 8 different emotional dimensions. So you'd see this color. It's, say you'd rate it very happy, it's very lively, it's very strong, it's not calm, it's not sad, blah, blah, blah. And you do that for all 32 of these colors. And then you do the same thing for each of these 18 musical selections. You get played that first piece I showed you, and you ask, how happy is this? How lively is this? How strong? And so forth. And then we're going to look at the correlations between the emotional ratings of the music. So along the x-axis, this is going for happy versus sad. So sad pieces of music go down here, and happy pieces of music go over here. And that CMA is just, it stands for the happy sadness of the colors that people pick to go with them. We have to integrate it because they did 4, if they did 5 different choices or whatever. You can just think about it in terms of the color that goes best with it. How happy at the top versus sad is it? And so we plot those points and compute the correlation, and damn, I had never seen a correlation like that. And I worried for a long time that there's some flaw in the experiment that meant that it had to come out that way, because in fact, all of them did. You know, our lowest correlation was 0.89, which is higher than most people ever see anywhere. But in fact, it's not the case that there's a flaw. I mean, we have gotten lower correlations. I'm not going to have time to go into that. But it seems that that emotion does, to some degree, to a large degree, mediate this cross-modal correspondence between music and color. And I'm not going to go through with this. But we've also done the same sort of thing with single-line piano melodies where we can control everything about how fast and slow and whether it's major and minor. We've done it with different genres of music. So here's country western. And here's classic rock. So 34 different genres. And again, now one of the interesting things that happens is that with these different genres, you know, remember not much happened with red versus green with the classical music? Now we get a lot of red action going on because you've got anger and, you know, violence and agitation starts to come into the music, which really wasn't in the music before. We also get it with just 2-note intervals, and we do it with instruments, the timbres of instruments. And now we've started to look, instead of just with color, we've looked at what textures do people go with different pieces of music. So for the rock music, for example, they might pick something like this. For country western, they might pick something like this. And similarly, we've also done it now with the shapes of lines, where sometimes they're smooth, curvy ones versus jagged ones and complex ones, and we find similar kinds of correspondences that seem to be mediated by emotion. Now, the reason that we did this initially was we got interested in synesthesia. That was our initial motivation. It was in that course I was telling you about. Remember the Color and Consciousness course? And the way we did that course when we did the research was we had everybody in the class be a subject for everybody else. So to do the synesthesia research, we couldn't do it with synesthetes because we didn't have any music color synesthetes in the class, right? So we decided to do it with the people in the class, and that was what gave us the initial idea that there might be something here. But there is this wonderful movie called The Soloist, which actually gives a rendition of what a synesthete might actually experience while listening to music. And this is, in a way, kind of the other end of this arc of stuff, because Josh Peterson, who's sitting in the audience, and Thomas Langlois, and I are looking toward the possibility of creating music visualizers from using these results to get sort of psychologically, perceptually motivated, good music visualizers that people really like much better than the ones that are just based on whatever nerdy thing the guy who's writing the program happens to come up with. So this is a rendition of what it might look like to be a synesthete listening to Beethoven's Third Symphony. Don't you wish you were a synesthete? Now, it's a long way from there, from where we are to there. I want to sum up our research on aesthetic science, and actually the best way I could think of to do this quickly was to show you a collage that Karen Schloss made for me, which has little pieces of collage that each of which is related to research that we did together. And I want to say now some thank yous, because, so this is back to the good as it gets part. This is where it gets a little tough. It's been a glorious ride. I can't imagine having been happier anyplace else. I can't imagine any profession that I would rather be in. That's not to say it's always been easy. In fact, for the students in here, I want to tell a little anecdote. Has anybody heard of something called the imposter phenomenon? It's a phenomenon where you, for one reason or another, found it or not, believe that you are not talented enough to be where you are doing what you are. And I've had it at every transition point in my academic career, going from junior high to high school, from high school to college, from college to graduate school, and from graduate school to Berkeley. I considered resigning at the end of my first year at Berkeley. You know, there was this department full of these spectacular scientists doing all these wonderful things, and I just, you know, how could I possibly cut it? Well, I look back now. One of the wonderful things about giving this talk is I look back on my career, and I actually did some pretty interesting and important things. And I'm proud of them, and a lot of them might not have gotten done or might not have gotten done in the way they got done or as soon as they got done because I was the one who did it. But I didn't do it alone. I did it with a lot of help, so I want to thank my help. So the first is this is thanking my graduate students and postdocs. These are not all people whose chair whose committee, dissertation committee I was chair of, because I shared a lot of students with Eleanor and with a few with Marty Banks and Irv Rock and so forth. They're a wonderful group of people, and I've benefited from working with every one of them. I want to thank my undergraduates too, especially in the last decade or so, particularly since Karen has been in my lab. We've had a lot of them. And please forgive my missing untold numbers of undergraduates who worked with me, but I don't have records that I could consult. The graduate division gave me the names of graduate students to look through, so that was much easier. I want to thank my co-authors on papers because, in fact, we learn so much by actually writing things down. I think that I've got everything figured out, and then you go to write it down on a piece of paper, and all of a sudden you realize, how do I get from there to there? And if you collaborate with your co-authors and you work it out, hopefully you work it out. I want to thank my co-teachers. So these are not all in psychology. Some of these people are in vision science and elsewhere. Even one of them, Dom Massaro, is actually from UC Santa Cruz. These are all people that I've co-taught with. And I've got to say, that's another place you just learn a ton by co-teaching. And Berkeley is a wonderful institution, at least it used to be when I was teaching. I don't know whether it's still true or not. But they used to give you full credit for co-teaching a course with somebody as long as you were both there. But that's where the payoff came, but both of you being there and listening to the other person. I have to give you another Eleanor anecdote. I once said, and I think it's still true, that I would rather hear Eleanor give a lecture than anybody else I ever taught with, or maybe even heard. And the reason was because she would be talking about something that I thought I knew. And she would talk about it in a way that turned it upside down and pulled it inside out. Now, I don't know how the undergraduates felt about that, but I thought it was wonderful. She would pull in these remote associations about things that I had never put together with this, and it was a joy. And finally, I want to thank all of my colleagues in the Berkeley Psychology and Cognitive Science programs. These are the people that sort of off the top of my head have been most important in my development and my teaching and my research. There's many, many more who have influenced me and helped me. And finally, I want to thank, or maybe not finally, I want to thank my partner, Avi Kreitzman, who is sitting up here in the front, who we've been together for 3 years now, as of about a week ago, and looking forward to an awful lot more years together. I want to thank you for your attention, interest, and those wonderful memories. And one more thing, remember, the journey is the reward. Thank you. I believe that there's food and drink in the back. Oh. Oh, yes. I thought I used all that time up. Sure.
I'm going to walk around and hand the mic.
Yeah, the color music thing seemed to be dominated by tempo. I mean, was there an interaction with the minor major key? I didn't see one that you posted.
Tempo is the most important factor in the stuff that we've done, but I mean, tempo and major versus minor are two little pieces of musical structure. It doesn't look at dynamic range, it doesn't look at instrumentation, it doesn't look at timbre, it doesn't look at all kinds of distortion. In the research that I couldn't talk about, where we did the 34 different genres, we actually had people rating about 15 different musical dimensions, and most of them loaded in some way onto both emotion and the colors that people picked.
You said that you looked into how much the color sophistication of your subjects affected their color preferences.
Yeah.
Did the musical sophistication of your subjects affect the mapping between music and color?
We haven't really looked at that yet. I think we have some data on it for the genre thing, which we haven't published yet, but so we don't really know. And we haven't systematically manipulated it by getting music majors versus non-music majors. There is a related piece to this, which is not something that I had time to talk about, but we call this preference for harmony. And it doesn't just mean musical harmony. It actually came initially out of the work on preferences for color pairs. There are certain color pairs like light blue and dark blue and brown and beige that are harmonious with each other, and there's others like purple and orange which are disharmonious with each other. And we found that even though when you look at the average across everybody, most people like harmonious pairs, there's huge individual variation. All individuals for which the correlation between their ratings of harmony and preference are 0.8, down to people whose correlations are minus 0.8. And we did a systematic study where we included art majors, music majors, and psychology majors with looking at people's ratings, these correlations between preference and degree of harmony or goodness or whatever. And basically what you find is that across the boards, psychology students like the harmonious ones the most because they're the least sophisticated about music and art. For the color and visual stuff, the art students have the lowest preference for harmony, with the music students in between. And for the music students have the lowest preference for harmony, with the art students in between. So the way we kind of understand this is that there is a sort of fairly stable individual difference in what we call aesthetic style, which is preference for harmony. And then then the people who have low preference for harmony to begin with kind of self-select to go into the arts. And that once you get into art school or music school or whatever, you get additional training and you get a lot of additional experience with art and music that tends to lead you to like the more novel things, which tend to be the less harmonious things. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, which the answer to which is actually I don't know. We haven't done it with the color and music.
So you mentioned about the heyday of cognitive science on Berkeley, and I've heard that other places that there was this period. And so, what's your thoughts about why the energy changes over time? Like, why is there not as, or maybe you feel that there is still as strong a cognitive science community here, and what might drive changes there?
Well, what drove the change sort of away from cognitive science or sideways from classical cognitive science, I guess, was brain imaging techniques, was technology, I think. That gave a whole new set of dependent measures and a whole new set of questions and a whole new way of looking at things. I've often been asked by publishers and others when I'm going to write the revision of vision science. And my answer is always the same: I'm not writing the revision to the vision science. What needs to happen is somebody needs to come along who looks at the fields sort of like I did back in the 1980s and says, well, we really need a textbook that's going to put this, all this cognitive neuroscience and perceptual neuroscience together with some of the classical stuff and write, the new version of that is attuned to cognitive neuroscience and includes all the imaging results and all that sort of thing. I don't know whether David's still here. Yes, he is in the back. I asked David if he wanted to co-author a book like that with me, and then I advised him against it for a number of different reasons. And he was smart enough to, let's just say, not say yes. I don't think he ever said no, but we never had a second conversation. Rona.
Yes, about the association between color and music. So you tested two populations, basically, there was the Latin American and the American population.
The Mexicans and the Bay Area.
Right. I was wondering whether if there must be a high cultural influence on that aspect, and maybe testing like Asian people or people from Africa on those, or either using music from there on our European-derived population would be interesting to see how much of that.
That's what we're doing. I have a I shouldn't say we're doing because I have a collaborator in Turkey, and they've put together a set of traditional Turkish music with a similar kind of slow to fast tempos and something like major versus minor, but Turkish music doesn't really have major versus minor, but there's major-ish and minor-ish. And we're going to be collecting the same data on colors and both the classical Western music and the traditional Turkish music, and doing it both in Turkey and in the Bay Area, but we don't have the data yet. Rona.
Wonderful talk, Steve. How did your scientific mind affect your art? And how did your art affect your science?
Yeah, good question. Well, certainly my art affected my science. I have less insight into whether my science affected my art, but my art affected my science in the sense that I already mentioned, which is that I got the D100, I started taking pictures and being able to print them on my printer and manipulate them in Photoshop and things like that, and that made me ask the question of myself, why do I like the pictures I like? Well, once you've asked that question, if you have any interest in answering it, then there goes the next decade of your life. Or it did me. So it's done that. It's also done more specific things. I mean, that edge region grouping paper that I talked about, where I just did the demonstration with the motion, one of them was blur similarity, and I actually noticed that initially with my photography, that if you're looking at something where there's two different surfaces at different depths, and you actually use a wide aperture so that you get narrow depth of field, you can either focus on the thing in front, in which case its texture and the edge is sharp and the things behind are blurred, or you can focus on the thing behind, in which case the texture on the front and the blurred and the edge between them is blurred. So that was actually the entree into edge region grouping. There's some other things that I've done. Let me see if I can think of some ones where, I think I do think about it. For example, I didn't talk at all about the research on spatial composition. So one of the things that, each one of these is like an hour-long talk. The one, color preferences is an hour talk. Spatial composition and the music color stuff is each an hour-long talk. If I go to a place and they want me to give a colloquium, I actually give them 3, sometimes 4 abstracts and say, I could do any one of these, which one do you want? I could even walk into the room and have them decide on the spot which one. So the spatial composition work, one of the things that we show is that, I won't go into the rule of thirds, but where you want an object to be in a rectangular frame depends on the perspective on the object. If it's a symmetrical object and you're viewing it head on, actually people like it to be in the center, which is where all the art books tell you it should not be. If it's an object that's facing to the right, they actually want it on the left side of the picture, and if it's an object same object facing to the left, they want it on the right side. We call this the inward bias. I think about those things when I'm composing pictures, but I try not to let myself be too heavily biased by it. My own feeling is that artists do what they do intuitively, and there actually are good reasons for why they do it. They may not know what they are, but it just looks right. This is a Mangan phrase, it fits, it's right, it's good, what are some of the other words that you use for that?
A lot of concerns. The issue is, what is the phenomenological representation of that feeling?
Yeah, well, that's your question. But whatever it is, I think that artists have that, and it's a good one, and they follow it. If you look, this is a larger scheme of things, if you look at the history of art and the history of vision science figuring out what artists are doing, they lag by about, 5 centuries or something. Michelangelo was doing crossed-hatched shading on horses' rumps before vision scientists had figured out what shape from texture was about, or shape from shading. That was all what they're doing. It took a long time to figure out what the sort of formalities are. So I think, and I really don't think that, when I do give these talks to groups that include artists, I typically say, don't do anything differently because of what I say, because it's really, we, the scientists, should be looking at what it is that you're doing and trying to figure out why you're doing that thing. And that's the important thing for me, trying to answer the why question. And this is another reason why I haven't kind of gotten onto the brain bandwagon. Some of you who know me and know the department know that I'm not somebody who's gone in that direction. And part of the reason is that from a phenomenon that we would study behaviorally, there's kind of 2 different directions, 2 different big directions you can go. One is what I call how questions, and the other is what I call why questions. So if you want to know about color preferences, you could ask a how question. It's sort of like, well, what does the brain do? What is it that lights up when you see a color that you like? And you could trace out the connections from the retina and the short, medium, and long wavelength cones all the way up to whatever that is. But that doesn't answer the why question. The why question is answered by the kind of theory that I talked about. The ecological valence theory is a theory about an answer to the why question. The reason that you like the colors that you like is because they're associated with the objects that you like. They're the objects that are good for you. When I give that talk, I talk about preferences as being essentially a steering mechanism. It's a way of getting an organism to go toward the good stuff and away from the bad stuff. So if you think about, for example, preferences for taste, we like things that are sweet and fatty, and we don't like things that are bitter and sour. Well, what's that about? Well, things that are sweet and fatty have high caloric content, and although that might not be good if you're trying to lose weight, as a species, it's something that's good for the individuals to consume. toxic and bitter things are much more, sour and bitter things are much more likely to be toxic. So if you go with a taste that's developed towards fatty and sweet kinds of tastes, you're going to consume the stuff that's better for you than if you go toward the things that are sour and bitter. So just plug in color there. It's like, okay, maybe you'll have more success as a person or an organism, not necessarily evolutionarily. It could be social success. If you kind of are attracted to the things that are the colors of things that are good for you, and away from things that are the colors of things that are not good for you, like yucky poo and so forth, and toward the strawberries, toward the leafy greens, toward the swimming pool and the clear sky, and away from those other things.
Is that why you're wearing a blue tie?
Perhaps. I have several colors. I try to be flamboyant.
Well, with that, why don't we thank Steve again for a spectacular